Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into tonight's game, I wanted to ask a question. Do you have extra cards lying around that you don't use? Want to buy or trade for some extra cards but don't know how to maximize the value? Then you should try out today's sponsor, Card Conduit. Card Conduit is the best service when it comes to selling your extra cards. They have three main services. Their standard service lets you send them your unsorted cards of any value. They will sort, grade, and give you the best price for your cards. Their curated service is similar. Send them your unsorted cards worth over $1 in value. They will charge half the fee of the standard service and charge no fee per card. Their sorted service is a great value as well. Choose cards in advance with their selection tool, send them sorted to Card Conduit, and they will grade and buy list them automatically. Save yourself the time of having to send to multiple sites and let Card Conduit do it instead. Their fee is only 2% with no fee per card. So give Card Conduit a try today. If you sign up with my link in the description below or use the promo code POWER, you will also get 10% off of their fees when you use their service. A big thanks to Card Conduit for sponsoring today's video. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Ryan piloting Godo Bandit Warlord. This deck seeks to cast its commander, fetch up Helm of the Host, and win with infinite combats. Ryan's opening hand contains a Bergi, God of Storytelling, Lotus Petal, Mana Crypt, Lion's Eye Diamond, Snow-Covered Mountain, and his London Mulligans are Goblin Matron and Chaos Warp. Next, we have Zach piloting the partner pair of Tymna the Weaver and Kraum Ludovic's Opus. This deck seeks to grind advantage with its commanders before winning with Thassa's Oracle or Underworld Breach. Zach's opening hand contains a Mystic Remora, Windswept Teeth, Mana Confluence, Fierce Guardianship, Enlightened Tutor, Mental Misstep, and a Wishclaw Talisman. After that, we have our Mox Pearl patron Peter from Wizards of the Coast piloting Kenrith the Return King. This mid-range deck seeks to grind advantage, disrupt opponents, and eventually win with Dockside Loops using its commander. Peter's opening hand contains a Mana Confluence, Lotus Petal, Tainted Pact, Worldly Tutor, Rhystic Study, Vampiric Tutor, and his London Mulligan is a Toxic Deluge. Finally, we have our Mox Pearl patron Chris piloting the partner pair of Dargo the Shipwrecker and Jeska Thrice Reborn. This is a storm deck that seeks to either combo with Dargo or can one-shot the table with Jeska. Chris's opening hand contains a Jeska's Will, Relic of Legends, Mox Opal, Mana Crypt, Shatter Skull Smashing, Deflecting Swat, and a Seething Song. Without further ado, let's kick off this outward overdrawn outstanding ownership. Ryan won the Savage Challenge and gets to start us off. Ryan draws a card for turn and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Bergi, God of Storytelling. He passes. Zach draws and plays a Windswept Teeth. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He casts Mystic Remora and passes the turn. Peter draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He ends his turn. Chris draws and plays a Shattered Skull, the Hammer Pass, and to play untapped, paying 3 life. He casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers and Zach draws. He casts a Mox Opal and Zach draws again. He casts his commander, Jeska Thrice Reborn, and Zach draws. He activates Jeska's first ability, targeting Ryan's Bergi. The table prepares for war, and Chris gives the turn to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Bergi. Zach takes 9 damage due to Jeska, and Ryan ships the turn. During his upkeep, Zach pays to keep his Remora. He draws, plays a Mana Confluence, and passes. At the end of Zach's turn, Peter taps his Mana Confluence to cast a Worldly Tutor. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. In response, Zach pays 2 life to cast Mental Misstep, countering the spell. Zach discards the hand size, and the turn moves to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter taps his Mana Confluence to cast Vampiric Tutor. Remora triggers, and Zach draws a card. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He draws for turn and casts a Mana Crypt. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. Peter casts a Lotus Petal, and Zach draws again. He cracks Petal to cast Rhystic Study, and Zach draws from Remora. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, countering the spell. Unfortunately blown out, Peter passes. During his upkeep, Chris loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Emergence Zone. He casts Jeska's Will, choosing both modes, targeting Zach. Remora triggers, and Zach draws. Then Chris adds 10 red and exiles Pyroblast, Mountain, and an Ancient Tomb. He casts Pyroblast, targeting Mystic Remora. Remora triggers, and Chris pays. Remora is destroyed, and Chris follows up with a Strike It Rich, creating a treasure. He casts Relic of Legends. He casts his commander, Dargo the Shipwrecker. He activates Jeska's first ability, targeting Bergi. Chris ends his turn. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and casts Brass Squire. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Bergi. Zach takes 9 through Jeska, and Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Zach casts Enlightened Tutor, fetching up an Underworld Breach onto the top of his library. Zach draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts a Lotus Petal. He casts a Chrome Mox, imprinting Vampiric Tutor. He casts an Underworld Breach. In response, Peter casts Mindbreak Trap. The table goes wild as Underworld Breach is exiled. Next, Zach taps his Mana Confluence to cast Wishclaw Talisman and then ships the turn to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and taps Mana Confluence to help cast Drannith Magistrate. Peter passes to Chris. During his upkeep, Chris wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a Mountain. He activates Jeska's first ability, targeting Dargo. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Dargo. Unfortunately, Zach cannot block. takes 21 commander damage, and Zach loses the game. Chris gives the turn to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a snow-covered mountain. He holds open blockers and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Chris wins his Mana Crypt flip. He draws and plays a City of Traders. He activates Jeska's first ability, targeting Dargo. He moves to combat and attacks Ryan with Dargo. Ryan blocks with Bergie and takes 12 through Jeska. Chris passes to Ryan. During his upkeep, Ryan loses his Mana Crypt flip and takes 3 damage. He draws and moves to combat. He attacks Jeska with Brass Squire. Jeska dies and Ryan passes. At the end of Ryan's turn, Peter taps Mana Confluence to cast Tainted Pact. He exiles from the top of his library until he exiles an Underworld Breach, putting it into his hand. The turn moves to Peter. During his upkeep, Peter loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and taps Mana Confluence to cast an Underworld Breach. He escapes Lotus Petal from his graveyard. He cracks it to help cast a Brain Freeze, with all copies targeting himself. He mills 9 cards. He escapes Lotus Petal and cracks it for a blue. He escapes Lotus Petal again and cracks it for another blue. He escapes Brain Freeze with all copies targeting himself, milling 18. He escapes and cracks Lotus Petal 4 more times, adding 4 blue. He escapes Brain Freeze, milling the rest of his library. He escapes Thassa's Oracle. It enters, and Peter wins the game. In this game, Zach's opening hand contains a Polluted Delta, Imperial Seal, Flooded Strand, Demonic Tutor, Simian Spirit Guide, Steam Vents, and an Arid Mesa. Peter's opening hand contains a Talisman of Dominance, Enlightened Tutor, Tainted Pact, Mana Vault, Esper Sentinel, Hallowed Fountain, and an Exotic Orchard. Chris's opening hand contains a Professional Facebreaker, Overmaster, Tybalt's Trickery, Mountain, Dwarven Ruins, Phyrexian Altar, and his Lena Mulligan is a Direfleet Daredevil. Ryan's opening hand contains a Manifold Key, Sandstone Needle, Wheel of Misfortune, Cloudstone Curio, Basalt Monolith, Grim Monolith, and his Lena Mulligan is a Karn the Great Creator. And Zach gets to start us off. Zach draws and plays a Bloodstained Mire. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Underground Sea onto the battlefield. He casts an Imperial Seal. He fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Zach passes. Peter draws and plays a Hallowed Fountain into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts an Esper Sentinel and passes the turn. Chris draws and plays a Dwarven Ruins into play tap. He ends his turn. Ryan draws and plays a Sandstone Needle into play tapped as well. Ryan passes. Zach draws and plays an Arid Mesa. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Tundra onto the battlefield. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand, adding a red. He casts Rhystic Study. Esper triggers and Peter draws. Zach ships the turn. During his upkeep, Peter casts Enlightened Tutor. Rhystic triggers and Zach draws a card. Then Peter fetches up a Mystic Remora onto the top of his library. He draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He casts Mystic Remora. Rhystic triggers and Zach draws. He moves to combat and attacks Zach with Esper. Zach takes it and Peter passes. Chris draws and plays an Urza Saga, getting its first counter. He passes the turn. Ryan draws and plays a Snow-Covered Mountain. He stares at 3 draw engines and ships the turn to Zach. Zach draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver. Zach ends his turn. During his upkeep, Peter pays to keep his Remora. He draws and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to cast a Mana Vault, paying for Rhystic. Peter passes to Chris. Chris draws, and in his first main phase, Urza Saga gets another counter. He plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Goblin as it enters. He casts a Professional Facebreaker. Rhystic triggers and Zach draws. Chris gives the turn to Ryan. Ryan draws and casts Jeska's Will, targeting Zach. Remora, Esper, and Rhystic trigger. Peter draws 2, and Zach draws 1. Jeska's Will resolves, and Ryan adds 9 red. He casts Grim Monolith. Mystic and Rhystic trigger, and each player draws. He casts Manifold Key, and both draw again. He casts Basalt Monolith, and both draw again. He casts Wheel of Misfortune. Both players draw, then Wheel resolves. Each player secretly chooses a number, reveals them, then Ryan takes 5 damage, and Ryan discards his hand and draws 7. Next, Ryan plays a City of Traders. He casts a Soul Ring. Rhystic and Remora trigger, Peter draws, and Ryan pays for Rhystic. He casts an Arcane Signet, and both players draw. With nothing else, Ryan passes. Zach draws and moves to combat. He attacks Ryan with Tymna. Ryan takes it, and Zach gains 2. In his second main phase, Zach pays a life and draws a card through Tymna. He plays a Volcanic Island for turn. He casts Gamble. Remora and Esper trigger, and Peter draws 2. In response, Peter casts Pact of Negation. Rhystic triggers, and Zach draws. In response, Zach casts a Pact of Negation of his own, targeting Peter's Pact. Remora triggers, and Peter draws. Pact counters Pact, and Gamble resolves. Zach fetches up a card into his hand and then randomly discards a Culling the Weak. He casts Silence. Remora triggers, and Peter draws. In response, Peter casts Force of Negation, exiling a blue card, targeting Silence. Rhystic triggers, and Zach draws a card. In response, Zach casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card. Remora triggers, and Peter draws a card. With no other actions, Force counters Force, and Silence resolves. Zach casts Cabal Ritual with Threshold, adding 5 black. Remora triggers, and Peter draws. He casts an Ad Nauseam. He reveals a Windswept Heath, Phantasmal Image, Chrome Mox, Snap, Mana Confluence, Intuition, Mental Misstep, Mystic Remora, Misty Rainforest, Demonic Consultation, Windfall, Chain of Vapor, Scalding Tarn, Lion's Eye Diamond, Grim Tutor, Gemstone Caverns, Wheel of Fortune, Felwar Stone, Exotic Orchard, Arcane Signet, Vampiric Tutor, Diabolic Intent, Talisman of Progress, Ragavan Nimble Pilferer, Rite of Flame, Verdant Catacombs, and a Dress Down, deciding to stop there. He cast Chrome Mox, imprinting Fire Covenant. He cast Rite of Flame, adding 2 red. He cast a Soul Ring. He cast an Arcane Signet. He cast a Lion's Eye Diamond. He cast Chain of Vapor, targeting Soul Ring. It bounces. Zach sacks a land to continue the chain, bouncing Chrome Mox. He sacks a land and bounces Arcane Signet to his hand. He sacks a land, bouncing Rhystic to his hand. He sacks his final land, bouncing Tymna to his hand, and stops the chain. He casts Soul Ring. He casts Chrome Mox, imprinting Dress Down. He casts Windfall. Each player discards their hand and draws 31 cards. He casts Mox Opal. He casts Lotus Petal. He casts a Mana Crypt. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters and Zach creates 9 treasures. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters and in response, Zach casts Tainted Pact, exiling his library. Oracle's trigger resolves, and Zach wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a fun set of games tonight. Congrats to Peter and Zach on their wins. In Game 1, Peter had barely enough cards to escape with Underworld Breach, so his math had to be exact. That, along with being a bit lucky with his Incept Tainted Pact, helped him close out the game. In Game 2, Zach knew exactly how to time his spells and interaction. He also figured out the exact lines he needed after his ad nauseum didn't pay off as well as he'd liked. He was able to chain his spells together properly and pulled out a win. The most valuable card in tonight's games, sponsored by Luxury Playstyle, goes to Mystic Remora. This card warped the games twice tonight, as each player had to pivot their strategies when they came down. Once Remora hit, they had to hold back or try and fight through it. It was enough to help each player who had them and shape the landscape of tonight's games. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of the competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.